The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and Alaric walked out into silence. Not the comfortable silence of a building winding down at the end of a long week. Not the kind of quiet that belongs to dimmed monitors and chairs pushed back and coffee cups left for Monday morning. This was a different quality of silence entirely. This was the silence of something finished, something decided, something that had already happened, and was not going to unhappen regardless of how long a man stood in the middle of it. The furniture was gone. The desks that had held project briefs and the ordinary debris of professional life, gone. The filing cabinets, gone. The carpet showed the pale rectangular outlines of where heavy things had stood long enough to leave their mark, and then stopped standing there. Along the far wall, a row of half-packed boxes sat with their flaps open, abandoned mid-task, as though whoever had been working through them had simply stopped at a certain point and decided they couldn't finish it today. Alaric walked through the empty space. His footsteps were precise on the cleared floor. The window at the far end held the same view it had always held. The city outside, the street below, the ordinary movement of everything continuing without reference to what had happened on this floor or what it had cost. He stopped at the reception desk. It was the last piece of furniture remaining, either the most logistically difficult to move, or the one that had simply been worked around while everything else was cleared. Its surface was nearly bare. A disconnected phone cradle, a blank notepad, a pen lying at a slight angle, as though it had been set down in the middle of something and not picked up again. And on the edge of the desk, folded in half with the careful precision of someone who understood that important things should be properly closed, a small piece of paper. He picked it up. He already knew what it was. He had been looking for it since the elevator doors opened. Without admitting to himself that he was looking, he unfolded it. A child's drawing, done in crayon, with the confident, slightly unsteady line quality that belongs to someone who has not yet learned that their hands are supposed to hesitate when the stakes are high. A building, tall, rectangular, filled with carefully drawn windows, each one a small, deliberate square. And at the very top window, the highest one, a single figure, dark against the pale paper. No features, no detail, just a shape that appeared to be watching something the drawing didn't show. Beneath it, in a child's careful print, the kind of print that takes real time because every letter is given what it needs. 4 words. I thought you'd stay. Alaric read them once, then again. He pressed the drawing flat against his chest with one hand, the gesture of someone applying pressure to a wound before they've decided whether to call for help. He stood in the empty office for a long time. And now the narrator needs to ask you something before the story begins in earnest, because this question is the engine of everything that follows, and if you don't feel it, the rest won't land the way it should. What kind of man walks away from the same woman twice? Not once. Once can be youth, once can be fear, once can be the understandable failure of a person who isn't ready for the size of what is standing in front of them. But twice, separated by 9 years, 2 different cities, and every opportunity a reasonable universe could offer to make a different choice. What kind of man does that? And more importantly, what kind of man does it take to finally understand what it cost him? Because this is not a story about a billionaire and a woman he lost, though it is that too. This is a story about a voice that was always in the room, a voice that was always reasonable, always professional, always arriving, with the smoothness of someone who has rehearsed the route at the same destination, and about what happens when a man finally, at 41 years old, in an empty office on the 14th floor, holding a crayon drawing in his hand, stops trusting it. Come in. Settle wherever you are tonight. If you are new here, you found us at the right moment. If you have been here before, welcome back. You already know how we do this. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I ask because it genuinely matters to me. The thought that this story can reach someone on a night shift in one city and someone curled up at home in another, at the same hour, with the same words, that is something I will not stop finding remarkable. If you have not subscribed yet, this is a quiet moment to do it. No urgency. Just, if this story finds you the way I think it might, it would be good to know you will be here for the next one. Now let me tell you what this story is actually about, because the surface will try to tell you something simpler, On the surface, a man built a $12 billion empire, and he still ended up alone in an empty room holding a child's drawing that said 4 words he couldn't argue with. But the why is where we live. So here is the question I want you to carry with you, not dramatically, just honestly. Have you ever made the safe choice, the reasonable choice, the professional choice, the one that looked correct on every available measure, and known in the first breath after you made it that it was wrong? Not catastrophically wrong, not wrong in a way you could point at and correct, just quietly, permanently, irreversibly wrong, the way a door sounds when it closes in a house you were supposed to stay in. If you have, you understand Alaric better than he understood himself for most of his adult life. Because here is the problem at the center of this story, and I want you to hold it carefully. Alaric spent 15 years trusting the wrong voice to make the right call. And he never noticed, not once, because the voice was calm and measured, and always arrived in the language of his own values. It never shouted, it never threatened. It simply, quietly, in the most professional register imaginable, steered him away from every instinct that might have saved him. By the end of tonight, we will know who that voice belonged to. We will know what it cost. And we will understand something a 7-year-old boy understood from the very first drawing he ever made. That some buildings, no matter how tall, have only one window that matters. Let us begin. The penthouse office of Voss Capital occupied the 62nd floor of a building Alaric had purchased outright 7 years prior, partly because the location suited a firm of his size and partly, though he would never have said this to anyone including himself, because he appreciated owning the thing he stood on top of. The office was a study in selection. Everything in it had been chosen with a particular deliberateness that distinguishes a person who understands that their environment is a statement from a person who simply has money. The desk was a single slab of black walnut, custom milled, with no drawers, because Alaric did not believe in drawers. Drawers were where decisions went to be forgotten. If something mattered, it lived on the surface. If it didn't matter, it didn't belong in the room. 3 monitors displayed real-time portfolio data, currency positions, and a news feed he kept muted because other people's urgency interfered with his own. A single bookshelf held exactly 14 books, not for decoration, but because Alaric had read precisely 14 books that changed the way he thought about capital, and he saw no point in displaying volumes that hadn't earned the shelf. He stood at the window on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, coffee untouched on the desk behind him, watching the city conduct its usual business of moving without asking anyone's permission. And he felt it again, the thing he couldn't name. It wasn't dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction was specific. You could locate dissatisfaction, attach it to a cause, fix the cause, and proceed. This was different. This sat behind everything like a low frequency in a building's infrastructure, the kind of sound you become aware of only when all the other sounds stop, and by then you cannot remember when it started or what the silence sounded like before it arrived. Alaric was 41 years old. Voss Capital controlled interests across commercial real estate, biotech, clean energy infrastructure, and a shipping logistics firm that moved more cargo through the North Atlantic corridor than any 3 of its competitors combined. His instincts were well documented. His discipline was the thing people mentioned in conference hallways when they thought no one was listening. His ability to sit in a room full of noise and locate the one signal that mattered. That was the quality that had built everything visible from this window. And yet, he could not find the signal inside himself. He could not run a diagnostic on his own restlessness and produce an actionable report. Alaric Voss did not tolerate unnamed variables. He had built an empire on the principle that everything measurable could be managed. The low frequency was not measurable, and this, more than the feeling itself, was what sat uneasily behind his eyes on Tuesday mornings when the coffee went cold and the city moved outside, and he stood at the window with nothing left to look at except the thing he had not yet looked at directly. He turned from the window, checked his calendar. The Hargrove meeting was at 9:30. A mid-tier consulting firm, an analytics platform his acquisitions team had flagged as worth a look. He would attend, evaluate, decide, the way he always did. The Hargrove team arrived at 9:26, 4 minutes early. Alaric noted this, and approved of it the way he approved of everything useful, silently, without expression. Filed. 3 of them entered the conference room first in the standard configuration of a team that has done this before. A senior partner, a junior associate, someone from legal whose name Alaric would not retain because legal names in straightforward acquisitions are interchangeable. And then the 4th person walked in. Alaric's hand was reaching for his notepad. It stopped. Not the dramatic stop of film, not the pen clattering to the floor and the world going slow. Just a pause, 1 inch of movement, arrested, a micro, hesitation that no one in the room would have caught unless they had spent years learning to read the particular silences of Alaric Voss. One person in the room had spent exactly 15 years doing that. But we will get to him. She was tall, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a way that was professional without severity. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse and carried a leather portfolio that had seen real use. Not decorative use, but working use. The kind that accumulates when the person carrying it is consistently in rooms that require preparation. Her posture was exact. Her face was composed with the particular composure of someone who has walked into 100 rooms like this one and expects to walk into 100 more. Her name was Eloin Sayer, and 9 years ago, Alaric had been in love with her. Not the word he would have used at the time, not the word he would use now, if asked directly, because Alaric did not trust words that resisted independent verification. But the feeling, the specific, structurally unsound feeling of being in a room with someone who makes the room itself irrelevant, that was present. It had been present 9 years ago in a graduate seminar at Columbia, and it was present now on the 62nd floor at 9:27 on a Tuesday, while 3 other people arranged themselves around a conference table and opened their laptops, and had no idea that the man at the head of the table had just been quietly knocked back nearly a decade by the sound of a door opening. Miss Sayer. He extended his hand. His voice was level. His handshake was firm and lasted the appropriate duration. Professional, appropriate, everything it was supposed to be. Mr. Voss. She took his hand. 2 seconds of eye contact. Her eyes met his, and in those 2 seconds, which is not a long time unless you are standing inside them, there was a question and an answer, and a door that neither of them opened. Then she sat down, opened her portfolio, and the meeting began. It was a good meeting. The Hargrove team was well prepared, their projections were realistic without being flattering, and Eloin presented the operational overview with a clarity that was almost surgical. She did not look at Alaric more than the presentation required. She did not look at him less. She treated him exactly as what he was, a potential investor with capital and conditions. And if any of that professionalism was carrying additional weight beneath its surface, she gave no indication. Alaric listened, asked 3 questions, each precise and fair. And if half of his attention was 9 years in the past, standing in a hallway outside a seminar room, holding coffee he'd bought for a woman who had already started walking away while he stood there holding it and said nothing. Nobody in the room knew that, not even him, fully. The meeting ended at 10:15. Hands were shaken. Cards were exchanged. Eloin gave him a single professional nod on her way out. One nod that contained absolutely nothing and absolutely everything depending on the man reading it. The room emptied. Alaric remained at the head of the table. His notepad was open. He had written 7 words in 45 minutes. Interesting firm. Ah! The voice came from the corner of the room, where a man had been standing throughout the meeting with the patient attention of someone who understands that the most important data never appears on screen. Lucian Thorne stepped forward. He was lean and precise, dressed in a steel-grey suit with no tie, and a watch that cost exactly enough to signal competence without signaling vanity. His face was angular and intelligent, and almost entirely unreadable, which was, if you understood the architecture of Alaric's world, the single most valuable quality a person in his position could possess. Lucian was Alaric's chief strategist, his senior advisor. 15 years of shared offices and shared flights and shared silences in the back seats of cars moving between cities at the hours when honest conversation happens, if it happens at all. If Alaric was the engine, Lucian was the navigation system, the voice that said, "Turn here, not yet, wait, this is not the time." and Alaric trusted him completely, the way you trust a voice that has never been provably wrong. "You seem distracted," Lucian said. Not an accusation, an observation, delivered with the same neutral precision he applied to everything. "I was thinking about their pricing model," Alaric said. "The margins are thin in third quarter." "Were you?" Not a question. The absence of a question, which in Lucian's vocabulary carried the same weight as one but cost less. Alaric looked at him. Lucian looked back. 15 years of shared silence meant that certain exchanges could occur entirely in the space between sentences, and this was one of them. Lucian knew. Of course he knew. He had been in the room. He had watched the hand stop an inch, one micro, hesitation, and he had filed it the way he filed everything, silently, permanently, without visible reaction. He said nothing further, picked up his tablet, adjusted his cuff, walked toward the door and paused, not dramatically. Nothing Lucian did was dramatic, and said, over his shoulder, in a tone so measured it barely registered as significant, "I'll have the due diligence report on Hargrove by Thursday. No rush on this one." Then he was gone. Alaric sat alone in the conference room, 7 words on his notepad. 45 minutes. None of the words were Elohim, but the space between them was filled with nothing else. The low frequency was louder now. It had found something close to a name, not a word yet, but a shape. Something between a voice he hadn't heard in 9 years and a question he had never learned to ask before the answer walked out of the room. If you have ever walked into a meeting and felt your past walk in right alongside you, sat down at the same table, opened a portfolio, and looked at you with eyes that remembered everything you were hoping they had forgotten, then you understand exactly where this man is right now. You know the specific weight of a room that contains an entire history alongside the agenda. And you know that the most dangerous moment in any man's life is not when something new arrives. It is when something unfinished comes back with better data than he has. Stay with me. This is the point where I want to pause and ask, are you with me so far? Drop a comment and tell me where you are tonight. If this story is already reaching you somewhere real, like this video so someone else can find it, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because where this goes next is where the story earns everything it just set up. 3 days passed. Alaric filled them the way he always filled time that threatened to become inconvenient, with work. He reviewed the preliminary Hargrove due diligence report that Lucian had forwarded Wednesday evening. He attended 2 board calls and a private equity luncheon where 3 different men congratulated him on the Meridian acquisition, and he accepted their congratulations with the kind of warm precision that looks exactly like gratitude and costs nothing. He ran 6 miles Thursday morning, 4 on Friday, and did not once allow himself to think about a woman with auburn hair and a leather portfolio who had looked at him for exactly 2 seconds with eyes that remembered everything. He was very busy not thinking about it. Friday afternoon brought him to the Creston building on a matter unrelated to Hargrove, a commercial real estate assessment his team had flagged the previous week. The meeting ran long in the way meetings run long when people are trying to say something they have not yet figured out how to say, and by the time Alaric stepped out of the elevator into the lobby, it was 20 minutes past 4, and the building had gone quiet around its edges. He was checking his phone for his driver's location when he noticed the boy. He was sitting on one of the low benches that line corporate lobbies for the visual suggestion of hospitality, the kind of bench no one in a building like this ever actually sits on. But the boy was sitting completely still, and there is a quality to a child's stillness that reads differently from an adult's. Adults go still when they are waiting. Children go still only when they are fully absorbed, when something inside them is working so hard that the outside has simply paused. The boy looked to be around 7, dark hair, slightly unkempt in the way of children whose mornings move faster than their coordination allows. He wore a navy jacket over a grey-collared shirt and small dress shoes that had been recently polished but were already scuffed at the left toe. The mark of someone who had been told to look presentable and had made a genuine effort and then immediately forgotten about it the moment something more interesting appeared. In his lap was a drawing pad. In his right hand, a black crayon. He was drawing with the total concentration of someone who has temporarily misplaced the concept of self-consciousness. Alaric should have walked toward the exit. His driver was 3 minutes out. There was a 7 o'clock dinner and a call to the Singapore office. He had already moved twice this week and could not move again. He walked toward the bench instead. He did not examine the decision. He simply made it, the way you make certain choices when something underneath thought moves first. "Good drawing," he said. The boy looked up. His eyes were dark and very direct, the kind of direct that belongs to children and very old people, the ones who have not yet learned or have long since forgotten the social softening that everyone in between manages constantly. He considered Alaric for 1 full second, then held up the drawing pad. A building, tall, rectangular, drawn with the architectural confidence of a child who has clearly spent time studying the real thing. Many windows, each one carefully rendered as a small deliberate square, and at the very top window, the highest one, a single figure. No face, no detail, just a dark shape against the pale background of the page, looking out at something the drawing did not show. "Which building is that?" Alaric asked, keeping his voice conversational. "A tall one," the boy said. Then, after a moment's consideration, "The tallest? Who's the person in the window?" The boy looked at the drawing the way an artist reviews a finished piece, not with doubt, but with the calm appraisal of someone assessing something they already know is accurate. "Someone who's always looking," he said. Then he looked back up at Alaric. "Do you ever feel like you're looking down at things instead of being in them?" The lobby was quiet. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a phone rang once and stopped. Alaric's phone showed his driver at 2 minutes out. He looked at the boy, 7 years old, dark eyes, crayon in hand, asking, with the casual precision of someone who does not yet know the question is difficult, the exact question the low frequency inside Alaric had been attempting to formulate for longer than he could measure. Sometimes, Alaric said, it was the most honest thing he had said to another person in recent memory. The boy nodded, satisfied. He looked back at his drawing. "My mom says I see things too clearly," he said. "But I don't think that's a real problem." Alaric almost smiled. He almost said something that would have been genuine and unguarded. The kind of thing you only say when someone has come at you from a direction you had not thought to defend. And then the elevator opened. He heard it before he saw her. The precise click of professional heels that belong to someone who moves through spaces without apology. And then Eloin Sayer crossed the lobby, coat folded over one arm and phone in her other hand, mid-sentence with someone on the other end of the call. For the second time in 4 days, she walked into a room Alaric was standing in and rearranged it completely without trying. She ended the call in the same motion as spotting the boy. Her face changed. Not the way faces change when something goes wrong. It changed the way a room changes when the last window catches the right angle of light and everything in it becomes briefly, quietly different. Something eased in her that she had been holding. Something else moved in. Something warm, private. Not for anyone else in the lobby. "Cal," she said. "I met someone," the boy said, without looking up from his drawing. Eloin looked up. The 2 seconds came again. Alaric counted them this time, not because he chose to, but because his mind had apparently decided this was now a measurement worth taking. 2 seconds. Her eyes went from recognition to composure in less time than that, and the composure was professional and exact, and gave away nothing. "Mr. Voss." Her voice was level. The voice of a woman who had, in the past 4 days, done precisely the same kind of very busy knot. Thinking that he had, "Miss Sayer." He kept his hands where they were. No handshake this time. The one on Tuesday had cost him more than he wanted to calculate. "Your son?" "Yes." She moved to the bench and placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy, Calum, he understood now, held up the drawing pad for her without interrupting his coloring of the window frame. She looked at it for half a second, then looked at Alaric again. Something passed through her eyes that she resolved immediately. The way you resolve an equation the moment you recognize its variables. He was supposed to wait upstairs. "The chairs up there don't have good light," Calum said reasonably. Eloin's hand on his shoulder tightened by a degree, not in alarm, not in anger, just in the specific way of a parent whose child has no idea how accurately he has been operating. "Let's go," she said. She picked up his drawing pad and held it against her arm the way you carry something fragile. "Thank you," she said to Alaric, brief and clean. "The way you thank a stranger for holding a door." And then she steered Caleb toward the lobby entrance, one hand steady at his shoulder. For the third time in 4 days, Alaric watched Eloin Sayer walk away from him. This time, she had a child beside her, and the child was carrying a crayon. And the drawing she had pressed against her arm was a tall building with one figure alone at the top window. The lobby doors opened. They stepped through. They were gone. Alaric stood on the marble floor of the Creston building lobby and tried to locate what was moving through him. It was not nostalgia, exactly. It was not longing in any form he had vocabulary for. It was something more structural. The feeling of standing in a room and suddenly understanding that the walls had been bearing weight you never accounted for, and the only reason you had not noticed was because the building had not fallen yet. He told himself it was coincidence. A city this size generates improbable intersections constantly. Eloin worked in consulting. The Creston building was commercial property. He was conducting an assessment. The probabilities required nothing mysterious. He told himself this clearly, with the kind of internal authority he brought to every board presentation, every acquisition argument, every data to backed case he had ever made for the decisions that had built his world. He did not believe it. His driver sent a message. "Out front when you're ready, sir." Alaric pocketed his phone. He walked toward the exit. And the question followed him out into the afternoon air, persistent and accurate, in the voice of a 7-year-old boy who had never been told it was supposed to be difficult to ask, "Do you ever feel like you're looking down at things instead of being in them?" Here is what the narrator needs you to understand, and pay close attention to this part, because it is the key to everything that comes after. The figure in that drawing, the lone shape at the top of the tallest building, looking out at something the drawing did not show, was not a child's invention. It was not the kind of generic figure a 7-year-old places in windows because windows need occupants. Caleb had drawn that figure before he knew Alaric's name. He had drawn it the way a child draws something they have perceived clearly and simply recorded. He had drawn it because it was what he saw when he thought about the kind of man who stands at the top of something and still does not feel that he is anywhere. You understood that before Alaric did. I suspect you understood it the moment you heard the 4 words written beneath it in careful print. He was still catching up. The deal progressed. This was the professional language for it, and professional language was the only language either of them was using, so it seemed appropriate. The Hargrove acquisition assessment moved through its standard phases with a kind of clean momentum that suggested everyone involved was focused entirely on the work and thinking about nothing else. Meetings were scheduled, agendas were circulated, action items were assigned and completed and checked off lists. And if the weekly rhythm of it meant that Alaric and Eloin sat across a conference table from each other every Thursday at 10 o'clock, that was simply the structure of the process and had no additional significance. This is what both of them told themselves. Alaric was reasonably confident. Eloin believed it more completely than he did. The Thursday meetings were held in the smaller of the 2 conference rooms on the 48th floor, sleek and deliberately impersonal, with a glass table, 6 chairs, a single whiteboard, and a view of the skyline that was impressive enough to suggest seriousness without becoming a distraction. Lucien attended the first 2 meetings. After that, Alaric told him it was not necessary. Lucien said he agreed and observed nothing further. Lucien had not attended the Thursday meetings since the second one, but he had read every briefing note that crossed Alaric's desk, and he missed nothing. What Alaric did not tell Lucien, what he told no one, because there was no one in his life to whom this kind of information could be directed without consequences he was not prepared to manage, was that he had begun to notice things, not important things, not things with any bearing on the acquisition assessment or the behavioral analytics platform or the restructuring timeline. Small things, the kind of things that should not be worth noticing and are therefore, when you notice them repeatedly, worth paying significant attention to. Eloin circled figures in her notes rather than underlining them. He had never seen anyone else do this. She would write a number, consider it, and then draw a clean circle around it. Not a frantic loop, not an approximation, but a deliberate circle, as if placing a boundary around something she had decided to keep. He noticed this in the second meeting, and then spent the third meeting not noticing it so actively that he circled 3 of his own figures without realizing it and had to flip the page. She kept her coffee to the left of her notepad. Always, even in rooms where the cups were set to the right by whoever had arranged the space, she would move it quietly without comment and position it at the exact left corner of whatever she was working on. He watched her do this in the 4th meeting and understood, from the complete absence of thought in the gesture, that she had been doing it for years and had never once been asked why. He did not ask. The fact that he wanted to ask was already more information than he needed. And at the end of a long point, when she had finished walking through a projection or dismantling a figure from his team that she felt was overly optimistic, she would pause and look toward the window, not with any readable expression, just a brief redirection of her gaze, a fraction of a second, as though she was confirming that the outside world was still where she had left it. Then she would turn back and continue with the composed certainty that suggested the window check had resolved something she had not needed to name. He noticed. He hated that he noticed. He noticed that he noticed, and hated that too. It became a reasonably productive source of private irritation that at least gave the low frequency something specific to occupy itself with. The work itself was good. That much was simply true, separate from everything complicated about it. Eloin was precise in a way that went beyond preparation. She had a quality that the best professionals he had ever hired sometimes approximated but rarely achieved, which was the ability to hold 2 conflicting projections in her head simultaneously and tell you not which one was right, but what conditions would determine the outcome. She did not oversell the Hargrove platform. She did not paper over the third-quarter margin problem he had flagged. She presented it straight and then presented 3 structural approaches to addressing it, with honest assessments of the risk embedded in each. He found this genuinely impressive. He was also aware that finding it impressive was doing nothing to simplify his situation. The confrontation, if it could be called that, which it could not really, because both of them were far too controlled for the word to apply fairly, happened in the 5th week, a Thursday. The other members of the Hargrove team had cleared the room after a meeting that had run 15 minutes long. His own associate had stepped out to take a call. For the first time since the initial meeting on the 62nd floor, Alaric and Eloin were alone in a room together. She was closing her portfolio. He was standing at the window, the opposite position from the one he usually held, the city behind him instead of in front, because he had been making a point about sight visibility, and the rest of the room had simply evacuated around the conversation. He became aware of the silence, the way you become aware of a sound when it stops by the contrast of it. "You're still at Hargrove," he said. It was not what he had meant to say, but it was the first available sentence that was not about revenue projections, and his instincts, which had been waiting patiently for 5 weeks, took the opening before he could organize anything more considered. Eloin looked up from her portfolio. Her face was composed the way it always was, not cold but set, like something that had been through enough weather to have established its final form. "I joined 18 months ago," she said. "It was a good position. I know. I read the background materials." Then the question had an answer already. She said it without edge. Just a fact, identified and returned to sender. Alaric looked at her. 5 weeks of Thursdays, and the 2 seconds of lobby recognition, and the crayon drawing pressed against her arm. He was 41 years old. He had a $12 billion empire and 14 books, and an ability to read a room that was, by any reasonable account, exceptional. And he was standing at a conference room window with a sentence in his mouth that had been waiting 9 years to be spoken. "You left," he said. "Columbia. You were gone. And I never understood the timing of it." Something moved through her face. Not the composure that was always there, but something beneath it, brief and deep, and controlled the way you control something that has learned over a long time to stay where it is put. "You chose," she said. "I left because of what you chose." She closed the portfolio fully, set her hands flat on the table. "You made a choice, and I made a choice, and mine meant leaving. That's not a mystery. That's an equation. What did I choose?" She looked at him steadily. The window check did not happen this time. She held his gaze the way you hold a position, Not aggressively, not defensively, simply as a matter of fact about where you are standing. "You chose what you always choose," she said. "The version of a situation that has the least amount of exposure, the deal with the most controlled outcome." She paused for exactly one beat. "Oh, I wasn't a controlled outcome." The room held this. Outside, the city continued its usual business of moving without reference to what was happening on the 48th floor. "Eloin, I'm not interested in revisiting it." Her voice was not cold. It was the opposite of cold. It was the voice of someone who has done significant work to arrive at a position and has no interest in dismantling that work for the comfort of someone else's unresolved past. "I built something. I built Calum, and a career that I'm proud of, and a life that works. And I'm not interested in putting any of what I've built at risk." She stood, picked up the portfolio. "The due diligence report is ready for your team by Monday. The Q3 margin approach, I'd recommend option 2. It's the most defensible in a soft market." And then she walked out of the conference room with the same precision she brought to everything. Not hurried, not performing any particular emotion, simply clear about where she was going and what she was leaving behind. The door closed with a quiet, final click. Alaric remained at the window. The city was doing what it always did, generating visible evidence of motion and progress and productive urgency. Normally, this view confirmed something he needed. Confirmed. Right now, it was doing none of that. He looked at the clock on the wall. 17 minutes past 11. He had a call at noon and a lunch at 1:30 and a board presentation to review before end of day. The structure of the afternoon was clear, sequenced, actionable. Every item on it had a defined outcome. He stood at the window and looked at the clock and understood, for the first time in a professional career built on the premise that data was sufficient, that he was in a situation where it was not. Where the data, 9 years, a conversation, a woman who was not waiting for him to find the right approach, told him one thing. And everything else, the low frequency and the 4 words in careful print, and the question a 7-year-old had asked him in a lobby on a Friday afternoon, told him something else entirely. He was good at choosing between 2 options. He had made that choice professionally, repeatedly, for 15 years. He took the data, he trusted the analysis, he called the outcome, and moved forward. And here was the thing he was only beginning to understand about himself. Standing in an empty conference room at 17 past 11, with the city outside and the clock on the wall, he had been making that same choice his entire adult life. Not just in boardrooms, in everything. In every room where something real had walked in alongside the professional agenda, he had looked at his data, trusted his analysis, and called the outcome. And the outcomes had been correct. Every metric confirmed it. Every quarter validated it. Every number on every monitor bore witness to how right he had consistently been. Eloin Sayer had built a life. She had built Calum, and a career, and a world that worked. She had done it without him, and she had done it well. And she had stood in this room with a locked door and the only key. And she had been polite and clear, and completely immovable, in the way of someone who has earned the right to be exactly where they are. She was not a prize to be strategized toward. She was not a problem with a solution he had not found yet. She was a person who had made considered choices with the same seriousness he applied to his own. And the considered choice she was currently making did not include him. His phone buzzed. His noon call, confirming. He answered it. He was professional and precise, and said everything that needed to be said in exactly the time available. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at this. But the question walked with him out of the conference room and into the elevator and down 48 floors to the lobby, patient and quiet and accurate in a way he could not find an angle on. What do you do when the data is right and the data is wrong at the same time? And who, in 15 years of making every major decision with the guidance of the same trusted voice, had been speaking into that question? And what had that voice actually been telling him to choose? That last question is the one that keeps me up at night when I think about this story. And I think it should, because we all have voices we trust. Voices that have been in the room so long they start to sound like our own thinking. And sometimes we don't notice the difference until we're standing at a window, watching someone walk away with the only key. If you know exactly what I mean, drop it in the comments. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this one tonight, share it with them. The next part of this story is where everything Alaric thinks he knows begins to loosen at the corners, and you do not want to miss it. The chess set lived on a low table in the corner of Alaric's penthouse study, not the office but the room adjacent to it, the one that existed outside of business hours and held the 14 books and a leather chair that was the single most comfortable object he owned, and a drinks cabinet that contained exactly 4 bottles, each selected the same way everything in Alaric's life was selected, deliberately, without excess. And with the understanding that quality is a form of discipline, Lucien came on Thursday evenings when the week had been complicated. This was not a formal arrangement. It had simply become the pattern over 15 years, the way certain things between two people who work closely enough become pattern without being named, the way water finds the same channel without being directed. Alaric would pour, Lucien would set up the board. The game would proceed at the pace of the conversation, which was usually slow, because both of them thought before they moved, and neither of them had ever seen the point in rushing toward a position you had not fully considered. Tonight, the board had been running for 40 minutes. Alaric was down a knight and up a rook, and was not particularly concerned about either, because the endgame he was building did not require the knight, and the rook was a distraction Lucien had not seen yet. He was looking at the middle of the board. He was thinking about a Thursday conference room and a portfolio snapping shut, and the word risk used with the precision of someone who knew exactly which specific thing she was protecting. "You moved your bishop without looking at it," Lucien said. Alaric looked up. "I looked at it. You looked at the board. The bishop is not the board." Lucien reached for his drink, a single measured sip, set back in the exact position it had come from. "You've been doing this since Tuesday. I moved the bishop correctly." "Yes, that's not what I said." Lucien considered the board for a moment, with the patient attention of a man who had learned that silence, strategically placed, does more work than most sentences. "This is personal," he said, "not professional. The Hargrove numbers are clean. Whatever is moving through your head right now isn't coming from the numbers." Alaric said nothing. He moved a pawn. The pawn move was intentional and was not a concession of anything. Lucien watched it. Eloin Sayer. He said the name the same way he said everything, level, measured, with no particular inflection that would suggest the name had any weight attached to it. The inflection itself was a choice. Alaric had spent 15 years being impressed by Lucien's ability to deliver significant observations in the tone of casual footnotes, and he was only now beginning to notice that the tone was the technique. "She's running the operational overview," Alaric said. "She's good." "She is." Lucien moved his queen, a lateral slide that looked defensive but was positioning for something 3 moves out. "She's also a complication." "Explain." "Not to the deal. The deal is straightforward. The Hargrove acquisition closes cleanly at the current valuation. The analytics platform integrates within 18 months, and the margin question resolves itself with option 2, as she correctly identified. He paused. "The complication is optics. You have a prior relationship with the lead consultant on an acquisition you're personally overseeing. That's a line that most acquirers would keep behind glass. If the deal draws scrutiny, and at this valuation, it might that relationship becomes a question someone else gets to ask in a room you're not invited into. There is no relationship. There's history. There's a difference." "Is there?" Again, not a question. Lucien's specialty, the absent question mark that implies the answer, is already obvious to everyone except the person who needs to believe otherwise. "Alaric, you hired me to tell you things you don't want to hear before they become things you can't control. I'm telling you, the personal dimension of this is visible to anyone paying attention. And you're paying attention." "I'm always paying attention. That's what you pay me for." This was true. It had always been true. Lucien was the most attentive person Alaric had ever employed, and the attentiveness had been worth every dollar of his considerable compensation across 15 years of decisions that had built the empire currently supporting both of their lives. Alaric knew this. He had always known it. What he was only now beginning to sit with, and only barely, The way you sit with something at the very edge of your peripheral attention before you have decided whether to look at it directly was a different question. Not whether Lucien was attentive, but what, precisely, he was attending to. Lucien reached inside his jacket and produced a single folded document. He set it beside the chessboard without ceremony. The way you set down something you have been carrying for a while and have timed the setting down of. The Mercer Group reached out this week, he said. And infrastructure fund, very clean, looking for an analytics play in the behavioral space. Essentially, the same assets Hargrove brings, different seller, no complications. I had a preliminary conversation. They're motivated. Alaric looked at the document. He did not pick it up. When did they reach out? Earlier this week. When earlier this week? Lucien held his gaze without any visible alteration of expression. Wednesday. The day after the Thursday meeting, the day after Eloan had walked into the 62nd floor conference room for the first time, and Alaric's hand had stopped 1 inch from his notepad, and Lucien had stood in the corner and observed everything with his patient architectural attention. Alaric filed this information in the part of his mind that processed irregularities, not yet as a conclusion, but as a data point that needed a home. The Mercer proposal arrived, he said, 1 day after the Hargrove meeting. Infrastructure opportunities move quickly, you know that. I know that. He looked at the board. His rook was exactly where he had placed it. His pawn was doing its work. The bishop Lucien had questioned was in precisely the right position, and would be seen to be so in 4 moves when the geometry of it became apparent. What else did you do Wednesday? A fraction of a pause. Not a long pause. Lucien was too skilled for long pauses. But a fraction. 1 degree shorter than his usual smoothness. I made some calls. Standard due diligence on the competing opportunity. Nothing outside the scope of my role. Who did you call? Alaric. The voice was still measured. Still the voice of the most professional man in any room it had ever occupied. The Mercer proposal is sound. The Hargrove deal is fine. I'm not telling you to abandon it. I'm telling you to consider whether your reasons for continuing it are the same reasons you started it. He stood, straightened his jacket, picked up the document from beside the chessboard, and placed it directly in front of Alaric, with the same deliberate quiet he brought to everything. The small, unremarkable motion of a man who has positioned a piece and is now stepping back to let the board do the rest of the work. You don't have to decide tonight, Lucien said. I'll have a full Mercer briefing on your desk by Monday. You can look at both options with clear eyes. He finished his drink, set the glass down. Good game. He left the way he always left, without urgency, without drama, with the kind of unhurried certainty that belongs to people who have learned that the most effective exits are the ones that leave the other person sitting with the decision they have already made for them. The door closed. Alaric sat in the leather chair with the chessboard in front of him, and the Mercer document beside his drink, and the city conducting its usual business of moving outside the window that he was not looking at. He looked at the board instead. The position was still the same, his rook, his pawn, his bishop correctly placed. The end game he had been building for 40 minutes was still there, still available, still correct. Lucien had made calls the day after the Hargrove meeting. The Mercer opportunity had arrived within 24 hours of Eloan walking into the 62nd floor. The proposal was clean and reasonable, and presented as a simple alternative, with none of the complications. And the language, always reasonable, always logical, always arriving at the same destination, had done what it always did. It had framed the situation as a professional question about optics and risk and clear eyes. It had made the personal dimension sound like an exposure to be managed rather than a thing that might, if examined honestly, be worth something. Lucien had been in the room when Alaric's hand stopped. He had seen the 2 seconds. He had said nothing in the conference room and everything in the penthouse study, and the sequence of those 2 choices was, now that Alaric was sitting with the board in front of him and the city behind him, and no one else in the room to occupy the silence, beginning to form a shape he could not quite name yet, but could almost see. He picked up the Mercer document. He read it. It was thorough, professionally prepared, and arrived at a recommendation that was, by every measurable standard, sound. There was nothing wrong with it. There was nothing in it that any reasonable advisor would not have surfaced in the same position. It was the kind of document that defied objection because every sentence in it was correct. And this, the perfection of it, the seamless, unassailable reasonableness of every paragraph, was the first thing in 15 years of reading documents Lucien had prepared. That made Alaric sit back in his chair and look at the ceiling and wonder what a document looks like when it is built not to inform a decision, but to confirm one that has already been made. He set it down. He looked at the chessboard for a long time. His bishop, 4 moves from making everything clear. He had built a $12 billion empire on the principle that the right information, read correctly, always told you what to do. He believed this. He had staked everything on it, repeatedly, and been right. But sitting in the leather chair with the city outside and the board in front of him, and Lucien's measured architectural voice still filling the silence it had left behind, for the first time Alaric began to wonder whether the information he had been reading for 15 years had always been written by the same hand, and whether that hand had always been writing toward the same ending. Whether the voice he had trusted above every other voice in his professional life had been telling him the truth, or telling him a version of the truth so precisely calibrated to sound like the truth that he had never once needed to look for the difference. He did not know yet. He was 41 years old, and he did not know. But he was, for the first time, looking, and that right there, that moment of a man in a chair beginning to look at something he has been too comfortable to examine, that is where every important story actually begins. Not in the crisis, in the quiet. In the moment before the crisis, when you still have choices and you are only just realizing which ones matter. If this story is finding you somewhere real tonight, I want to know. Drop a comment and tell me what you are thinking. Like this video if you want someone else to find it, and stay close, because what Alaric is about to discover about the voice he trusted most is not something you will want to come to late. 3 weeks passed, and in those 3 weeks, something shifted in the way Alaric moved through his days, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to most of the people who shared rooms with him, but in the way attention shifts when you have finally asked yourself the right question and are waiting for the data to arrive. He did not rush the Hargrove decision. He let the deal proceed at its own pace, attended the Thursday meetings, reviewed the operational briefs. Eloin remained precise and professional and gave no indication that anything had changed since the conference room conversation. But Alaric was paying attention now in a different way. Not to the deal, to the architecture around it. He started noticing the pattern in his own history. Small things at first, then larger ones. Decisions he had made that had felt at the time like his own clear thinking. Relationships that had ended at moments that seemed, in retrospect, unusually well. Timed with professional pivots. Opportunities that had been presented to him in the language of strategy and had resulted, almost without exception, in a life that kept him more isolated than connected, more powerful than accessible, more successful than attached to anything he could not control. He did not confront Lucien, not yet. He simply began asking a question he had never thought to ask before. When Lucien gave advice, who did the advice serve? The answer, when he looked at it squarely, was more complicated than he had assumed. And then, on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week, Alaric did something he had not done in 15 years. He called his head of internal compliance and requested a full advisory record audit. Lucien's complete file, every recommendation logged, every external communication recorded, every contact notation from the past 15 years. Comprehensive. And without Lucien's knowledge, the compliance officer, a woman named Petra, who had worked for Voss Capital for 11 years and had the particular unflappable quality of a person who has been asked to find things other people would prefer stayed unfound and has never once hesitated, said she would have a preliminary review within 48 hours. She delivered it in 36. The file was extensive. 15 years of careful, professional, impeccably documented advisory work produces a significant paper trail, and Lucien had always been thorough, which meant the record was detailed enough to be its own evidence, if you read it with the right question in mind. Alaric read it at the black walnut desk with the city outside, and no monitors muted because he did not need the monitors. He needed the file. The first thing he found was a pattern, not a single act, not one provable deception. A pattern. 5 years of recommendations that had consistently redirected Alaric away from personal connection. A woman named Nadia Reeve appeared in the file. 4 years ago, a professional who had consulted on one of Voss Capital's infrastructure acquisitions and who had for approximately 8 weeks occupied a space in Alaric's life that was more than professional and not yet named. He remembered her. He remembered the 8 weeks. He remembered that they had ended with a conflict of interest flag raised by Lucien. Documentation suggesting that her firm had a secondary relationship with a competitor, making the personal connection a potential liability. He had accepted this. Of course he had. The language was reasonable, and the flag was documented, and Lucien had presented it with the same professional neutrality he brought to everything. Alaric pulled the compliance cross-reference now. The conflict of interest documentation had been raised on a Tuesday. Lucien had made 4 calls to the competitor's holding group on the Monday before, not to flag the conflict, but to a secondary contact with no operational role in the acquisition. The calls had no logged business purpose. The conflict documentation appeared the following morning, fully formed and impossible to argue with because by the time it existed, the evidence it cited was real. Lucien had not fabricated a conflict of interest. He had quietly, efficiently, without any single act that could be identified as wrongdoing, made one exist. Alaric set the page down, picked up the next one. 2 investment opportunities, one in the 6th year of their partnership, one in the 9th, would have required him to relocate for significant periods. Both had been redirected through Lucien's advisory process with arguments so technically sound that Alaric had reviewed them at the time, agreed with the assessment, and moved on. He reviewed them now, with the specific question of what the alternative might have looked like, and understood that the arguments were not wrong. They were simply incomplete. They presented the risks of relocation clearly and the opportunities of relocation not at all, in the way you can tell a selective truth so precisely that it functions as a complete one without containing a single false statement. Alaric had built an empire on his ability to read a room. He had read every room correctly for 15 years. He had not, until this morning, understood that someone had been designing the rooms. Then he reached the Mercer documentation. Petra had flagged it with a single line of annotation. See attached. Date discrepancy, external contact log. She had not editorialized. She had simply marked the place where the shape of things became undeniable. Lucien's first logged contact with the Mercer Group's representative was time-stamped at 8:40, 1 in the morning on Wednesday. Not after the Hargrove deal had progressed. Not after the Thursday meetings had established a pattern. Not after the dinner or the lobby conversation or any of the weeks that followed. 8:40, 1 in the morning. The day after Eloin Sayer had walked into the 62nd floor conference room for the first time, and Alaric's hand had stopped 1 inch from the notepad. 1 meeting, that was all Lucien had needed. 1 room, 1 observation, 2 second exchange of eye contact between 2 people who had 9 years of history standing behind them. Lucien had seen it, assessed it, and made his first call before the morning had finished. He had not moved after the risk became apparent. He had moved the moment the risk appeared. Alaric sat with this for a long time. The compliance report was still open. The city was outside. The monitors were unmuted for once, and he had forgotten to notice. The second flag was on the last page. Another annotation from Petra, brief and precise, with the quality of someone who has found something she would prefer not to have found, but whose professional integrity does not permit her to omit it. External contact. Hargrove Relocation Services, C log. Lucien had called the relocation firm Hargrove used, not Hargrove's partners, not the acquisition team. The logistics company managing the transition of the 14th floor office to its new space. He had called them 4 days before the formal separation notice was sent. The log showed a conversation of 11 minutes. No content record. It was an external call. But 11 minutes with a relocation firm, 4 days before a separation notice, with no documented business purpose connected to any active Voss Capital project. 11 minutes. To make the path of leaving easier than the path of staying, he had not threatened anyone. He had not interfered with anything in a way that could be documented or proven or raised in any room. He had simply, with the quiet efficiency that defined everything he did, removed the friction from the exit, ensured the transition moved quickly, ensured the formal separation landed with a completeness that felt final rather than provisional. Lucien had not destroyed anything. He had simply ensured that the door, once nudged, closed all the way. Alaric closed the compliance file. He set his hands flat on the black walnut desk, both of them palms down, the gesture of a man making contact with the only surface that is definitely still where he left it. He understood now, not partially, not provisionally, fully. The geometry of 15 years laid itself out in front of him with the patient clarity of something that has been there the entire time, waiting for the correct angle of light. A man does not need to be imprisoned to be contained. He does not need to be deceived about facts, to be steered away from truth. He needs only an advisor who is present in every room, who speaks in the language of his own values, who identifies risk with impeccable accuracy and opportunity with selective vision, and who benefits, professionally, financially, structurally, from the continued isolation of a man who is most valuable when he has no one else to turn to. An empire run by a man who is awake to his own life, who has love and context and perspective, and someone sitting across from him at a dinner table who tells him when he is listening with half his attention, is an empire run by a man who notices when the steering wheel is being moved, and a man who notices that is a man who no longer needs the advisor who has been moving it. Lucien was the most useful person Alaric had ever employed. He was also the most costly, and the cost had never appeared on any of the 14 monitors, in any quarterly report, in any document that could be audited, because the cost was not financial. The cost was a 14th floor full of rectangular ghosts and half-packed boxes, and a drawing in a child's careful hand, and 4 words that a 7-year-old had understood before any analyst in any boardroom in any city had thought to ask the question. The most dangerous lies, the narrator needs you to understand, are not the dramatic ones. They are not the fabrications, the false data, the provable deceits that can be walked into a room and placed on a table as evidence. The most dangerous lies are the ones dressed in loyalty, the ones that arrive in the language of your own values, the ones that tell you exactly what you believe and use that belief to walk you, with perfect professional smoothness, in the direction that serves them and presents itself, every step of the way, as the direction that serves you. Those lies do not leave marks. They leave absences, empty offices, unanswered calls, the pale outlines on a carpet where something stood for long enough to matter, and then, one ordinary Tuesday, did not. Alaric picked up his phone. He did not call Lucien. He would deal with Lucien, and that dealing would be thorough and final, and would be conducted in the language of documented evidence and professional consequence, because that was the only language the situation deserved. But first, there was something else, something that mattered more than consequence and more than clarity, and more than any of the professional resolution that would follow. He scrolled to a number he had called twice, and left one voicemail for, and sent one carefully worded email to, and had not been answered by, in 11 days of silence that had felt each morning heavier than the one before. He pressed call. It rang. The most dangerous lies are the ones dressed in loyalty. I want you to sit with that for a moment before we move on. Really sit with it. Because most of us have had a voice in our lives that sounded exactly like wisdom and was something else entirely. A voice that used our own values to redirect us. That made the wrong road feel like the right one because the language was always so reasonable. If you have ever looked back and understood, all at once, the geometry of how you got somewhere you never meant to be, you know exactly what Alaric is feeling at this desk. Tell me in the comments. I want to hear it. And stay, because that phone is ringing. And what happens when it is answered is where this story either saves itself or does not. He waited 3 days before reaching out. This was a miscalculation, though he did not recognize it as one at the time. He told himself the 3 days were considerate, that reaching out immediately after the separation notice would look like management, like damage control, like the professional and the personal stitched together at the seam in a way that would undermine both. He told himself he was giving her space to receive the professional communication and separate it cleanly from everything else, the way you separate variables in a calculation to isolate the one you actually want to examine. What he was actually doing was the thing he had always done, wearing a different name. He was deferring. He was giving the distance just enough room to become definitive while telling himself it was courtesy. On the fourth day he called. The phone rang 5 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was professional and exact her name. A request to leave a message, a thank you for calling, that contained no particular warmth and no particular coldness, only the clean efficiency of a woman who had long since learned not to put more of herself into professional communications than the communication required. He did not leave a message. He told himself this was because he wanted to speak to her directly, and a voicemail was not the right register for what he needed to say. He called again the following morning. Voicemail again. This time he left one. Brief, carefully worded, carrying as much of the truth as he could fit into 40 seconds without it sounding like an argument. She did not call back. He sent an email on day 6. He wrote it 4 times before sending the final version, not because he was uncertain what he wanted to say, but because he was uncertain what register would reach her. Too formal, and it would read as an extension of the professional separation, another document in the sequence of documents that had already done their damage. Too informal, and it would read as entitlement, as a man who had pulled away the professional flaw and then expected the personal structure to hold without it. He split the difference as honestly as he could. He said that the acquisition decision had been structural and not personal. He said that the dinner had been real and that he was not prepared to let the sequence of events make it otherwise. He said he would like the chance to speak with her, if she was willing. She read it. He could see the read receipt timestamp in the bottom corner of his sent folder. 10:40 to 7 on a Thursday morning, which meant she was probably at her desk, probably between meetings, probably sitting with the email open for long enough to read it twice in the way she read everything that mattered. She did not reply. He called the Hargrove main line on day 9 because he had run out of direct channels that felt appropriate, and he was running out of the patience required to maintain the careful management of a situation that was, he was beginning to understand, already beyond the kind of management he knew how to do. The receptionist, a different voice from the one he had spoken to during the engagement, informed him that the Hargrove team had concluded their current project cycle and several staff members were working remotely during the office transition. Office transition, Alaric repeated. Yes, sir. The 14th to floor lease concluded at end of month. The team is operating from a transitional arrangement while the new space is finalized. He thanked her. He set the phone down. He sat at the black walnut desk and looked at the city and felt the specific, structural quality of silence that descends when something has moved past the point where a phone call can reach it. He went to the Hargrove building on a Tuesday. He did not examine this decision closely before making it. He was aware that examining it would produce reasons not to go, and he had already spent enough of his life producing reasons not to go places that mattered. He told his driver to take him to the building where Hargrove had been, and he took the elevator to the 14th floor, and the doors opened. And now we return to the moment where this story began. The lobby bench was empty, not unoccupied, empty. The kind of empty that tells you something was there and is now not there. And the absence is the point. No drawing pad. No small figure in a navy jacket with a scuffed left shoe and a crayon moving across paper with the confidence of someone who has not yet learned to doubt what they see. Just a bench against a wall in a lobby that had gone quiet at its edges, in the way of spaces between purposes. He walked through the main door of the Hargrove suite. The furniture had been moved. He had known this from the receptionist's description, the transitional arrangement, the concluded lease. But knowing it and walking into it were different experiences, and the difference registered in his body before it reached anything he could process with language. The desks were gone. The filing cabinets were gone. The particular configuration of the space that had held 7 weeks of Thursday meetings and margin projections and circled figures and coffee at the left corner of a notepad, gone. The carpet held the pale, precise outlines of where things had stood. Rectangular ghosts, arranged in the exact positions of objects that had been there long enough to leave their mark, and then, one ordinary day, had not. Half-packed boxes lined the far wall. Their flaps were open. Someone had begun the task of clearing the last of the space and had stopped mid-process, either because something more pressing had intervened or because the completeness of it had been too much to finish in a single effort. Either way, the boxes sat with a particular quality of suspended tasks, things that had been started and were waiting for someone to return and finish them. He walked through the empty space. His footsteps were precise on the emptied floor. The window at the far end of the room held the same view it had always held: the building across the street below, the ordinary movement of the city going about itself without reference to whatever had happened on this floor or what it had cost. He stopped at the reception desk on his way back to the elevator. It was the last piece of furniture that had not been moved, either because it was the most logistically difficult or because someone had simply worked around it while the rest of the space was cleared. Its surface was mostly bare. A disconnected phone cradle, a blank notepad, a pen lying at a slight angle, as though it had been set down in the middle of something and not retrieved, and on the edge of the desk, folded in half with the careful precision of a child who has learned that important things should be properly closed. A small piece of paper. He picked it up. He unfolded it. A building, drawn in crayon. Tall, rectangular, with more windows than could be counted, each one a small, careful square. And at the very top window, the highest one, the one that looked out at everything below without being part of any of it, a single figure, dark, against the pale page. No features, no details, just a shape that was watching something the drawing did not show. And beneath it, in a child's careful print, each letter given the time it needed, each word its own considered thing. "I thought you'd stay." Alaric stood in the empty office on the 14th floor with the drawing in his hand, and the city moved outside the window without asking his permission, and the half-packed boxes waited against the wall, and the carpet showed the ghosts of everything that had stood here and then stopped standing here. And he understood with the specific, structural, irreversible understanding of a man who has been in this moment before and this time is finally letting himself know it. What it had cost. Not the deal, not the acquisition, not the Mercer briefing and its clean close and its 42 pages of sound professional judgment. What it had actually cost. He pressed the drawing flat against his chest with one hand, the same gesture he had made before, without understanding why his hand did it. He understood now. You press a wound before you have decided whether to call for help. And then, when you have decided, you make the call. He stood in the empty room for a long time. The question was no longer whether he had made the wrong choice. That question had its answer, and the answer was written in crayon in a child's careful print, and was not going to change, regardless of how long he stood with it. The question, the only one that remained, the one that everything from this moment forward would be an answer to, was what kind of man he was going to be now that he knew. The drawing was still in his breast pocket. He had carried it there since the 14th floor, through the elevator and the lobby and the car ride home and the night that did not include sleep and the 36 hours of compliance documentation and the phone call that had rung out to voicemail again because she was either not answering or not near her phone, or had seen his name and made the considered, reasonable, entirely defensible choice not to pick up. He had carried it the way you carry something you have decided is the most important object currently in your possession, without articulating why, because articulating it would require admitting how much weight you have placed on a piece of paper small enough to fold twice. He took it out now, set it on the black walnut desk under the light, looked at it properly for the first time since the empty office, not with the accumulated grief of that moment, but with the clear, specific attention of a man who has decided that the next move he makes will not be managed or deferred or run through the language of professional consideration. It will simply be true. The drawing, the building with too many windows, the lone figure at the top, the 4 words in careful print, and in the bottom right corner of the page, small, partially obscured by the edge of the crayon work above it, but legible if you held it at the right angle under the right light, a stamp, the kind of stamp that art supply shops press into the back pages of drawing pads and the bottom corners of sketchbooks. A name and an address, printed in ink the color of old brick, slightly smudged from where a small hand had pressed the page against something during the drawing process. An art supply shop, a street name, a neighborhood on the west side of the city, 12 minutes from where the quiet restaurant had been, 15 from the Creston building in the part of the city where the streets narrowed slightly and the buildings were lower, and the light in the evening came in at a different angle than it did on the 62nd floor. Alaric looked at the stamp for a long time. He understood that it had not been overlooked. Eloin Sayer did not overlook details. She circled her figures instead of underlining them. She kept her coffee at the left corner of every notepad. She moved through every space she occupied with the deliberate attention of someone who knows that the details are where the truth lives. She had pressed a folded drawing into the edge of a reception desk in an empty office. Whether she had known about the stamp or simply trusted that a man paying full attention would find his own way, the drawing was there, and so was the address. She had not left a door open. She did not deal in open doors. She had said as much in a conference room with a locked door and the only key, but she had left something smaller than a door, a corner of a stamp on the bottom of a page, a neighborhood, a street, the minimum possible direction that could not be called an invitation and could not be called its absence. The rest was his to do or not do. As it had always been, he put the drawing back in his breast pocket. He stood. He did not call his driver. He did not call ahead or prepare remarks, or organize his thoughts into the kind of structured argument that had served him in every boardroom he had ever occupied. He did not bring anything with him except his coat and his keys and the folded drawing and the truth, which was not a prepared thing and could not be made into one, and which he had been avoiding for reasons he now understood with a completeness that made avoidance no longer possible. He took the subway. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was simply the most direct route to the west side at this hour, and he was done, as of this morning, with choosing the option that managed his exposure at the expense of the thing that mattered. He sat in the car with his coat on, and the city moving through the windows in the underground dark, and he did not review anything. He looked at his hands. He thought about a dinner table and a lit window in a crayon drawing, and a question a boy had asked him in a lobby that he had answered honestly, and that honesty had felt like the first clean breath he had taken in a long time. He found the art supply shop first. It was closed at this hour. The lights were off, the door locked. A small handwritten sign in the window listing weekend hours in careful print that reminded him, with a precision he did not need, of the handwriting on the drawing in his pocket. He stood in front of it for a moment, and then looked up at the street around him and began to walk. The neighborhood was quiet in the particular way of residential streets in the early evening, not empty, not loud, occupied by the ordinary sounds of people arriving home and windows lit from inside, and the distant specific clatter of someone's dinner preparation carrying through a ground floor window. He walked 2 blocks north and 1 block east, following the logic of the street layout, the way he followed the logic of everything, by looking at what was in front of him and trusting the direction the structure suggested. He found the street. He found the house. It was the kind of house that had been chosen with the same deliberate attention that Eloin brought to everything. Not the largest on the block, not the most. Architecturally distinctive, but solid and well kept, and clearly inhabited by someone who understood the difference between a house that is maintained and a house that is lived in. A front porch with 2 chairs, a window box, a path from the gate to the door that was short and direct and did not waste steps. And in the front window, the one on the left of the door at the ground floor, casting warm light out onto the porch and the path and the small section of street directly in front of it, a lamp was on, and through the glass, just visible through the gap where the curtain did not quite reach the frame, 2 figures at a table inside, a small one, a tall one. The small one was leaning over something on the table, drawing or reading, or both simultaneously in the way of children whose concentration is large enough to hold several things at once. The tall one was beside him, slightly angled, her hand near the page but not on it, present without directing. They were not performing anything. They were not arranged. They were simply there, inside the lit window, in the ordinary quiet of an evening that had no idea it was being looked at. Alaric stood on the pavement outside and looked at the window and understood something that arrived not as thought but as recognition. The specific structural recognition of a man who has seen something before in a different form and is only now seeing it in its true one. Calum had drawn this house. Not a house. This house. The porch with its 2 chairs. The window box. The lit front window. The 2 figures at the table, the small one leaning and the tall one beside him, both of them still in the way the drawing had rendered them, present, unhurried, belonging to the same frame. He had drawn it the morning before Alaric saw it in the waiting area outside the conference room, before he knew what Alaric would do or not do, before any of the dinners or the separation notices or the compliance files or the 11 days of unanswered calls. He had drawn it at his kitchen table with the same total absorption he brought to everything, pressing the crayon down with the confidence of someone who is not inventing but recording. The boy drew the feeling before he knew the names. That was what he had said in the waiting area, about the house with the lit window and the two figures at the table. But here is what the narrator needs you to understand. Standing outside this house on this quiet street with the warm light falling through the gap in the curtain, Calum had always known the names. He had known them the way children know things that adults have talked themselves out of, not through argument or analysis or the accumulation of evidence, but through the simple, accurate perception of a person who has not yet learned to distrust what he sees. He had not drawn the feeling before he knew the names. He had drawn what was already true. He had drawn it because it was true, because it had always been true in the way that certain things are true before they have been allowed to happen. And he had pressed the crayon down with complete confidence, because doubt had not yet been explained to him as a requirement. Alaric stood at the gate of the house and put his hand on the latch. His hand was steady. He was not performing steadiness. It was simply there, the way clarity is simply there when you have finally stopped arguing with it. He was not the man who had called twice and left a voicemail and sent an email and deferred for 11 days while the distance hardened. He was not the man who had taken the Mercer briefing and the formal separation language and the clean close over the thing that mattered. He was not the man who had let a trusted voice make the important calls while he looked at the data and called it enough. He was simply a man standing at a gate with a folded drawing in his breast pocket and the truth in his hands, and the only question left was whether he was going to stand there or go through. He went through. He walked up the path and onto the porch and stood in front of the door. There was a moment, brief, honest, not performed for anyone, in which he simply stood there, not gathering himself, not rehearsing. There was nothing to rehearse. Everything he had brought to this door was already in his hands and his chest and his breast pocket, and either it would be enough or it would not. And the only way to find out was to knock. He knocked 3 times, not too loud, not too tentative. The knock of a man who has decided to be present and is trying not to qualify it. Silence inside the house. Then the specific sounds of a home in the evening. A chair, a voice too low to distinguish words. Footsteps coming toward the door at a pace that was unhurried. The footsteps of someone who was not expecting a knock and was not alarmed by one. The door opened. Eloin looked at him. The narrator wants you to notice what was not on her face. It was not surprise, not the particular widening of the eyes and the reconfiguration of expression that belongs to genuinely unexpected arrivals. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been carrying 2 answers for an indeterminate number of days and was now standing in her open doorway with the warm light of her house behind her, choosing between them. She looked at him the way she looked at everything important, directly, without flinching, with the calm of someone who has done enough internal work to face the external event without being reorganized by it. She said nothing. She waited. She had always been better at waiting than he was. She had proved this across 9 years and 11 days, and an entire professional engagement conducted at close quarters with something unresolved sitting in the room alongside the projection data. He spoke first. "I found out what Lucien did," he said. He kept his voice level, not controlled in the old way, the way of a man managing his exposure, but level in the way of someone who has decided that clarity is more important than self-protection. Not just the Mercer deal, the full pattern. 4 years ago, there was a woman and he manufactured a conflict of interest to make it easier for me to step back. 2. Investment opportunities that would have taken me out of his immediate sphere, both redirected with arguments that were technically correct and structurally incomplete. And you. He paused for one breath. He called Mercer the morning after you walked into the 62nd floor. Before the deal had progressed, before any of the Thursdays or the lobby or the dinner, one meeting was all he needed to know that you were a threat to his position. And he started moving the pieces before I had any idea there were pieces being moved. Eloin listened. She did not interrupt. She did not arrange her expression into any particular response. She listened the way she listened to everything, with full attention, processing in real time, giving the information the honesty it deserved. "He also called your relocation firm," Alaric said, 4 days before I sent the separation notice. "He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't interfere with anything that can be named as direct wrongdoing. He just made the path of your leaving smoother than it needed to be. He made the notice land with a finality that was shaped so that when it arrived, it felt like the end of something rather than a pause in it." A beat of silence. The evening air was cool on the porch. Behind Eloin, through the hallway, the warm light of the house continued its ordinary, indifferent business. "I'm not telling you this to explain myself," he said. "I want to be precise about that. What Lucien did doesn't explain my choices. It explains the conditions around them. I still made every call. I still picked up the phone and sent the separation notice, and told myself I would reach out separately, and then waited 3 days because I was managing the situation instead of being honest about it." He looked at her steadily. "I made the wrong choice twice. The second time I made it knowing what I was choosing against, and there is no logic, no architecture of argument I can build that makes that defensible. I'm not trying to build one." Eloin had not moved from the doorway. She was holding the edge of the door with one hand, not tightly, just present. Her face had shifted by a degree that most people in most rooms would not have caught. But Alaric had spent 5 weeks of Thursdays learning the precise vocabulary of her expressions, and he caught it. Something beneath the composure had acknowledged what he said and was deciding what to do with it. "I want to tell you something else," he said. "Not about Lucien, about me." He reached into his breast pocket. He took out the drawing, still folded, still carrying the slight warmth of having been pressed close for 11 days. He held it in his hands, but did not open it. She could see what it was. She recognized the fold. "I spent 15 years building an empire with a voice I trusted telling me what the data meant, and I let that voice make the calls that should have been mine to make, because making them myself would have required being in the room in the way you said, not looking down from the top window, actually in it, with the exposure that comes with that, and the risk and the complete absence of a guarantee." He looked at her. "I was afraid of the exposure. I dressed it up as discipline and efficiency and data-driven decision-making, and Lucien dressed it up as professional advice, and between the two of us we built a life that worked by every measurable standard and cost me everything that can't be measured." He stopped. Let that land without adding anything to soften it. "I understand that now, completely. Not as a thing I'm telling you to make a case, as a thing I know, the way you know something when it finally costs you enough to teach you." The wind moved briefly through the porch. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood continued, indifferent and reliable, the way the world continues through the moments that feel as though it should stop. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said. "And I'm not asking for another chance. You've told me clearly what you built, and that it doesn't move for a possibility, and I believe you and I respect it." He looked at her directly, with the full attention that she had told him across a dinner table he used to withhold. "I have one question, and I'm asking it because you deserve to be asked honest questions by people who are actually paying attention." She waited. "Did you know," he said quietly, "when you walked back into that meeting room, that I would choose the deal again?" The question settled between them. He did not rush it toward an answer. He let it be what it was. An honest thing, asked by a man who has finally learned that honest questions are not requests for reassurance. They are gifts offered to people who are capable of answering them truly. Eloin looked at him for a long moment. The two answers she had been carrying were both still there. He could see them in the quality of her stillness, and she was not choosing between them any longer. She had chosen before the door opened. She was simply letting him see the choosing. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even and clear, and carried no cruelty in it. "I knew you probably would. You'd been making that choice for 15 years. One dinner doesn't change 15 years. She held his gaze. "But I needed to find out something I couldn't know from 9 years of distance. I needed to find out whether you would choose it and stay comfortable, or whether you would choose it and finally understand what it cost you. A pause, short and weighted. Whether there was enough of you left, underneath all the architecture, to recognize a real loss when you were standing in it. The silence after this was not empty. It had texture and shape, and the specific quality of something that has been said truly and is now simply present the way true things are, without requiring any management. "And now?" he asked. She looked at him, not for 2 seconds this time. Longer. The look of a woman who has examined every angle of a decision and is no longer in the examination phase, who has done her due diligence on the most important question in front of her and reached a position she can defend, not because it is safe, but because it is honest. She stepped back from the door, not dramatically. There was no music implied in the gesture, no weight placed on it to tell the audience how to feel. It was simply a woman stepping back from a threshold, a practical, physical step that created space where there had been a closed position. She did not open the door wider. She did not say, "Come in," with any of the warmth or ceremony that phrase can carry. She simply moved, with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything, and left the door open. He was still standing on the porch, understanding what the step meant, when a figure appeared at the end of the hallway behind her. Calum, in pajamas now, the navy jacket replaced by something soft and grey, his dark hair more unkempt than the daytime versions Alaric had met, and his drawing pad tucked under his arm in the way of someone who does not go anywhere without the tools for recording what he sees. He looked at Alaric in the doorway. His eyes were exactly as they had always been, dark, direct, entirely without performance. He did not look surprised. "I knew you'd knock," he said, not triumphant, not the satisfied announcement of a child who has won a prediction, just a simple, accurate statement from a person who had drawn the feeling before he knew the names, and had always known the names and had never once doubted the drawing. Alaric looked at the boy, then at Eloin, who had turned slightly at the sound of his voice, and whose expression had changed again, the composure still there but behind it now, visible to anyone, paying full attention, the particular warmth that lives in a person who has made a decision they believe in and is no longer carrying the weight of the 2 possible answers alone. He stepped through the door, and there it is, the knock, the step back, the boy at the end of the hallway who already knew. This is the moment the whole story was pulling toward, not a man with $12 billion making a grand gesture, but a man with the truth in his hands and nothing else, standing at a door that he had to earn the right to knock on. "I have been waiting for you to reach this moment with me, and now I need to know, are you satisfied, or do you need to know what happens next?" Inside that house, at that table, with those 2 chairs on the porch finally having the people they were always meant to hold. Tell me in the comments that you are here. Tell me what this story did to you tonight. Share it with someone who is standing at a gate somewhere, trying to decide whether to go through, and subscribe, because the final part of this story is where everything that was broken either holds or does not, and I promise you, it is worth staying for. Alaric stepped across the threshold. The house received him the way houses receive people who belong in them, without ceremony, without announcement, simply by being what it was, warm, inhabited, full of the ordinary evidence of a life that had been built carefully and was working, a coat hook by the door with 2 coats and a smaller one, a shelf of books with their spines facing out at varying angles, the particular smell of a kitchen that is used rather than displayed, a drawing pinned to the wall near the hallway's end, with the slightly crooked confidence of a child who has framed his own work without a ruler and considered the result acceptable. He did not look around in the way of a man cataloguing an environment. He looked around in the way of a man finally paying attention to the right room. The table was the one from the drawing. He recognized it, not because he had memorized Calum's crayon rendering, but because some things have an accuracy to them that you feel rather than verify. A round table, not large, with 4 chairs positioned the way chairs position themselves in a house that has occupants and opinions. A drawing pad at one end, a cup going cold beside it. 2 chairs angled toward each other at the end that receive the most light from the front window. Eloin made tea, not as a performance of domesticity, not as a way of filling the space with something to do. She made it because it was the hour when she made tea, and the arrival of a man who had knocked on her door did not change the hour. Alaric found this, in a way he could not immediately account for, the most settling thing that had happened to him in months. The world was continuing on its own terms. He was simply present in it. They sat at the table. Calum sat with them for a while, drawing something Alaric could not see from his angle, and then announced that he was going to finish his chapter and took himself down the hallway with the self-sufficiency of a child who has grown up in a house where adults have real conversations and understands without being told when he is not needed in one. The conversation that followed was not a resolution in the sense of a final cleared account. It was a beginning, in the sense of two people who have decided to be honest with each other about where they are and what they are willing to move toward, and what conditions they need to trust the movement. Elowen set conditions, not as walls, but as the honest requirements of a person who has built something she intends to protect and is extending consideration, not unconditional access. Alaric accepted them without negotiating, because he understood for the first time the difference between a deal and a gift, and what she was offering sat firmly in the category of the latter and deserved to be received as such. They did not resolve everything that night. The narrator wants you to know this, because stories that resolve everything in a single evening are borrowing from a currency they have not earned. What happened instead was simpler and more durable than resolution. A man sat at a table with a woman who had already survived him once, and a boy asleep down the hallway who had drawn the truth before anyone said it. And he was present, fully, both halves of his attention in the same room, pointed at the same things, belonging to the same moment without a parallel process running somewhere behind his eyes. For a man who had spent 15 years at the top of the tallest building looking down, it was the most grounded he had ever been. What followed in the weeks after was not a fairy tale, and did not pretend to be. The empire did not disappear. The world did not rearrange itself in reward for a good decision, because that is not how the world operates, and any story that tells you otherwise is flattering you, rather than respecting you. Lucian was removed from his position at Voss Capital following a quiet, thorough investigation that Petra completed with the same steady professionalism she had brought to the initial audit. The audit Petra had delivered in 36 hours was enough for Alaric to understand the pattern. The formal process of removing Lucian took 3 more weeks. The documentation was airtight. There were no dramatic confrontations. Alaric had one conversation with Lucian, conducted in the 62nd floor office with the door closed and both men seated, that lasted 40 minutes and covered everything the compliance file had established. Lucian did not deny the pattern. He did not confess to it dramatically either. He presented, to the end, the composed, reasonable face of a man who had made professional judgments and stood by their logic. He left the building that afternoon with his personal items in a bag that he carried himself, and he did not look back. And the city received him on the street below without any particular acknowledgement of what he had cost. The Mercer deal was renegotiated on Alaric's terms, with the conditions Lucian had embedded quietly removed and replaced by terms that reflected what Alaric actually wanted from the acquisition, rather than what had been shaped for him to want. It closed cleanly, as Lucian had always said it would, because the underlying opportunity was genuinely sound. That part had never been a lie. The best steering always contains real truth. It is the direction it points the truth in that determines the cost. Hargrove Consulting was reinstated as a consulting partner on an ongoing advisory basis through proper channels, with full transparency about the history of the separation and Elowen's complete awareness of and agreement to the terms. There was no pressure applied, no leverage used, no weight of $12 billion placed on a personal situation to bend it toward a professional outcome. Elowen reviewed the reinstated partnership terms herself, made 3 amendments, and signed when she was satisfied, separately and on her own schedule. As she did everything, the personal took its own time. Alaric did not push. He had spent enough of his life managing timelines to understand that this one belonged entirely to someone else's pace, and the only correct response to that was patience, not the strategic patience of a man waiting for the right moment to move, but the genuine patience of someone who has enough to do in the present to stop measuring the distance to the future. Calum drew a new picture. He showed it to Alaric on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the night of the knock, when Alaric had come for the 2nd time and then the 3rd, and the visits had accumulated their own quiet weight in the way of things that are becoming part of a structure rather than events being evaluated individually. He held up the drawing pad with the same matter, of fact presentation he always used. Not performing the offering, simply making it a door, open, not wide but open, hinged to a frame that implied a house without drawing the whole of it. And on both sides of the door, on the outside and the inside, both light. The same warm yellow he used for windows, the same careful pressure, the same total confidence of a person who is not inventing but recording what is already true. Alaric looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the boy. "Is that one finished?" he asked. Caleb considered. "I think so," he said, "but I might add something later." He capped his crayon with the authority of a man closing a file. "I usually know when there's more. Let me tell you what happened in the years between." Not from Alaric's side. We have been with him long enough now to understand his architecture, his controlled world, his empire and its 14 books and its muted news feeds and its carefully selected everything. We know what the years between looked like for him. They looked like $12.4 billion and a low frequency he could not name, and a chessboard and a trusted voice in a steel grey suit telling him, with perfect professional smoothness, exactly what to think. I want to tell you what they looked like for Eloin. She left Columbia in the autumn of the year she and Alaric stopped being whatever they had been, which had never been formally named, because Alaric did not name things that could not be verified by independent audit, and by the time she understood that about him, it was already too late to wish she had understood it sooner. She left without a scene, without a letter, with the specific, quiet decisiveness of a woman who has made a considered choice and intends to live inside it fully rather than at its edge. Looking back, she went to work. That was the first thing. Not the comfort of work, not the distraction of it. The actual, serious, structural work of building a career from its earliest foundations at a time when she had no cushion and no network, and no one to call whose number she had been given by the right person at the right dinner. She had her own intelligence and her own preparation, and the kind of focused persistence that looks from the outside like ambition but is, from the inside, simply the daily choice to keep going when stopping would be easier. She was good at the work. She had always been good at it. But being good at something and being recognized for being good at it are two different timelines for most people, and for Eloin, they were further apart than they should have been, and she knew why, and she made the choice every morning to do the work anyway, and let the recognition arrange itself on whatever schedule it was going to keep. Then Caleb. The narrator is going to be careful here because what matters is not the circumstance but the fact of him. The specific, clear, world-altering fact of a child who arrived and reorganized everything Eloin thought she knew about what she was building and why. He was not a complication. He was not a crisis. He was, from the first moment of his existence, a clarification. He made everything that had felt like sacrifice feel like selection. He made the future concrete in a way it had not been before. Not as an abstract destination, but as a specific, daily, irreversible responsibility that she accepted without hesitation and has never once set down. She raised him alone. This is the part I need you to hold clearly, because it is easy to say and hard to understand from the outside. She raised him alone while building a career from its foundations, in a city that does not slow down for either of those projects individually, let alone for both of them running simultaneously. She did not have unlimited resources. She did not have a network of people whose job it was to make her life function while she focused on the things that mattered. She had herself and Caleb and the work and the specific kind of organizational intelligence that comes from a person who has learned that the only way to keep everything moving is to never stop paying attention to which thing needs you most in any given hour. She built Hargrove from its early, uncertain years into the consultancy it became when Alaric's acquisition team first flagged it. She did not inherit the position. She earned it in increments, the way things worth having are earned. Not in one dramatic moment of recognition, but in the accumulated weight of consistent, excellent, unrewarded effort that eventually reaches a point where the reward has no option but to arrive. She became the kind of professional who could walk into a room of people with more capital and more history and more institutional credibility and present a position so clearly, so honestly, so without performance, that the room shifted without knowing why. She became, in other words, exactly the person she had always been, but now the world had had enough time to arrange itself around what that meant. And through all of it, through the building and the raising and the earning, and the years that accumulated without ceremony, into a life that worked and held and was genuinely, solidly hers. She did not think about Alaric every day. That is the truth, and it matters that it is the truth, because the version of this story where a woman spends 9 years suspended in the grief of a man who chose wrong is not this story, and was never this story. She thought about him sometimes, in the way you think sometimes about the version of a road you did not take, not with longing necessarily, but with the particular quality of attention that belongs to the unresolved. The question that does not have an answer yet does not require you to live inside it, but it stays. It sits at the edge of the mind's periphery, with the patient accuracy of something that knows it will eventually be looked at directly. She knew whose company had approached Hargrove. This is the first thing I need you to understand about Eloin Sayer, that changes everything you think you have been watching. When the Voss Capital acquisition inquiry came through, when the preliminary approach landed on the Hargrove partners' desks, with the clean efficiency of a firm that does not make inquiries it has not already decided to be serious about, Eloin was in the room. She read the name on the documentation. She set it down on the conference table. She looked at the window for the brief, confirming moment that she always looks at windows when something inside her needs a second to settle. And then she said, "I'll lead the operational overview." The other partners had questions about workload, about timing, about the logistics of her calendar. She answered each one with her usual clarity. No one in that room knew what the decision cost. No one in that room knew what she was carrying when she said it, or what question she had been sitting with since the name had appeared on the page. She had not come back by accident. She had come back with open eyes, and a question she had earned the right to ask after 9 years of building a life that did not require his answer. The question was not, "Will he choose me this time?" She had already decided that she was not a prize, and she was not waiting, and she was not interested in being either of those things for anyone, including a man. With $12 billion and a low frequency he could not name, and eyes that had stopped 1 inch from his notepad when she walked into the 62nd floor, the question was different. It was quieter. It was braver. Has he changed? And does he actually honestly know what he lost? She had not come to reclaim anything. She had not come with a plan or an agenda, or the kind of hope that is really just old wanting wearing a more acceptable coat. She had come, quite deliberately, to give them both one honest look, to find out if the man she had known at Columbia, the one behind the data and the controlled world and the careful management of everything that moved in his life, had done the work that would make him someone different from the man he had been. If the answer was no, she would close the deal, deliver the best operational overview of her career, and walk forward into the life she had built without looking back. She was good at not looking back. She had learned it the hard way and kept the skill sharp. If the answer was yes, if there was genuine evidence, not performance, not the grand gesture that costs nothing sustainable, but the daily, incremental, honest evidence of a man who had looked at himself clearly and decided to become someone his choices could be proud of, then she would let herself know it. She would not run toward it. She would not throw open the door she had locked with her own key, but she would acknowledge what she saw. She would let it be true. The narrator wants you to notice something, because most of us, when we think about courage, think about the person who stayed, the one who fought, the one who held on past the point where holding on made sense and came out the other side with their grip still intact. We celebrate the staying. But Eloin Sayer's bravest act was not surviving the leaving. She had survived that. She had built an entire life on the other side of it, and the life was real and good and did not need rescuing. The bravest thing she ever did was walk back into the room, not with armor, not with the kind of professional composure that she wore like a second coat, though she wore it well and it served her completely. But underneath the composure, beneath the circled figures and the coffee at the left corner of the notepad and the brief confirming window check, she had walked back in with the honest, unprotected question of a person who has learned that real courage is not the absence of risk. It is the willingness to look at something that could hurt you and choose to see it clearly anyway. She walked in to find out if the answer had changed. After the dinner, after the quiet restaurant and the honest conversation and 2 seconds of warmth at the door and the shape of something nameless carried carefully home in the evening air, She sat in her own kitchen, Calum long since asleep, and held a cup of tea she was not drinking, and asked herself the question she had come here to answer. She did not have the answer yet. But for the first time in 9 years, the question felt like it might be close to one. She did not know, sitting in her kitchen in the quiet after a dinner that had been more honest than she had prepared for, that the ground beneath the thing she was beginning to allow herself to consider was already being worked on by a careful architectural hand, that a document was being finalized 4 streets away, that the voice Alaric had trusted for 15 years had been making calls since the morning after she first walked in, and that those calls had a direction she had not been included in. She did not know yet. But the narrator does, and so do you. The narrator wants to leave you with something plain and true, because this story has earned plainness by now and does not need to dress itself in anything more than what it actually is. A man can build an empire from the outside in. He can take data and discipline and the right advisor in the right room and build something that by every measurable standard is extraordinary. He can sit at the top of it and watch the city move and be correct about everything that can be verified and still hear a low frequency he cannot name, because the frequency is not a failure of data. It is the sound of what data cannot reach. The only things worth having are built from the inside out, from what you are willing to be when the numbers do not support it. When the exposure is real and the guarantee is absent, and the only currency available is who you actually are, at the level that no monitor displays and no advisor can document and no clean close can replicate. Alaric had spent 15 years being the man his empire required. The night he took the subway to the west side of the city with a folded drawing in his breast pocket, and walked up a path to a door with a lit window and knocked without a prepared speech. That night he became the man his life deserved. Eloin had known when she said yes to leading the operational overview. She had known when she circled her figures and kept her coffee at the left corner of the notepad, and looked at the window at the end of long points, and walked back into the room she had earned the right to walk back into. She had not chosen him by accident. She had chosen, with full information and open eyes and the considered judgment of a woman who had done the work and built the life and did not need him to complete it, to give them both the honest look they deserved. She had believed, even after everything, that the man capable of that knock was already inside him. She had just needed to find out if he would let him out. He had. That is the story. And it is enough. The low frequency, the one he had never been able to name, was quiet. Not gone, but quiet, in the way of something that has finally found the room it was always looking for. And that is where we leave them tonight. At a table with a lit window and a drawing of a door with light on both sides, and all the ordinary work of becoming ahead of them, which is exactly as it should be. I want to know what stayed with you, not what you liked, what stayed. What moment sat with you in a way that you will carry out of this story and into tomorrow? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and this community's responses to this particular story have already meant more than I know how to say efficiently. If this story found you somewhere real, if it reached something you have been sitting with or someone you have been thinking about or a door you have been standing outside of, share it. Put it in front of the person who needs it. That is the only thing that matters to me. Subscribe if you have not, and stay close. The next story is already waiting in the fire, and if this one is any indication of the kind of evening we can build together in this space, you will not want to come to it late. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. This chair, this fire, this hour, it is always better with you in it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and knock on the door.